The coronavirus outbreak is rapidly changing our planning and orientations as the world is trying to cope with COVID-19 and face its consequences and challenges. At the Policy Center for the New South, we gave our annual Atlantic Dialogues flagship conference a one-year rest while embracing the rapid digitalization brought forth by the pandemic to offer a virtual alternative. This year's online AD talks are digitally bringing together the AD community that is at the heart of the conference's success, growth, and sustainability.
Okay, I think it's time to begin. Welcome everybody who's joining us online to this Atlantic Dialogues talk on a very important topic. The title is The Age of Disinformation. That's the age that we're living in these days. And I'm honored to be joined today by some incredible panelists to talk about this issue. My name is Blair Glencourse. I run an organization called the Accountability Lab. We've been doing quite a lot of work on these issues recently. I'm also an Atlantic Dialogues emerging leader. And so I'm excited to be here with you today and to talk more about all of this. I don't need to tell you, I don't think that disinformation and misinformation are really critical problems these days. I was reading a recent study by Science magazine about Twitter that showed that by every common metric, falsehood consistently dominates the truth on Twitter, and fake news and false rumors reach more people and penetrate more deeply into the social network than any other kind of information. About half of the people who are online these days say that they see fake news regularly, and as many as 15% say that they share misinformation purposefully. So this is a huge problem. Digital literacy and digital policy are unable to keep up, I think. COVID-19, of course, has only exacerbated these dynamics with the misinformation and disinformation that surround the pandemic. And conspiracy theories are gaining ground and are fueled by certain people in power and others to further their own aims and to sow mistrust in our systems. So this is an issue that could not be more important. And we have to address these issues urgently. So it's great today that we have some really thoughtful people to help us talk about this. Let me introduce them very briefly, and then they can talk more a little bit about their experience and themselves. Pascal Boniface is with us. He's the director of the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs. There's Bushra Ebadi, the co-founder of the Health and Information Literacy Access program, and also an Atlantic Dialogues emerging leader. There's Andres Shibani, the East and Central Africa correspondent for the Financial Times, and Richard Worley will also join us momentarily from Le Temps. He's the European Affairs correspondent. A quick note on housekeeping: you may be watching on Twitter or Facebook or YouTube. Do follow the conversations on those channels. On Twitter, the handle to provide thoughts or comments is @ATL_dialogues, and the hashtag is #ADTalks. And feel free to leave questions on any of those platforms, and they will be sent to me, and I can pose them to the panelists that we have today. So with that, let me move, Pascal, if I may, to you to begin with. Could you explain a little bit from your perspective what disinformation and misinformation are, and kind of globally and strategically, why are they important and why do they cause such a big problem for all of us? You may be on mute, Pascal. you might need to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Hi, everybody. I'm very glad to be, not to be in Marrakesh, unfortunately, but to be there by video conference and to participate to a very important matter, because in fact, democracy is at stake with information, disinformation, misinformation, because it's an attack against democracy. What is disinformation? What is misinformation? It's the contrary of information. You have information, which is facts, and you have fake news, which are not facts, could be opinion, but opinion is different from disinformation. We could have different opinion being sincere, both of us, both of all of us, but misinformation, it's a willingness to mislead the public, the willingness to bring the people to your point, but with not the goal of having a debate, but a goal to deceive the opinion. But I just would like to open the debate to make a few comments. First, it's not a new problem. Unfortunately, disinformation is as old as information, in fact. And what is new now, it's two factors. The first one, it's a surge of public opinion into the field of geopolitics. Because I think that I will talk above all of geopolitics, not on social matters and domestic matters. And in the former times, the public opinion was not a factor of geopolitics, or less than now. And so it's the bad side of the problem. As the public opinion is growing as a factor of international relations, it's more and more important to have public opinion in your favor. And sometimes people think that they must give disinformation because their cause is not sincere, their cause is not of general interest, and they need to deceive the public to obtain the attention. And the second thing, it's disinformation is not only the problem of complotists, of people behind the scene. It could be also the action of government. And we have all in mind, for example, the so-called weapons of mass destruction, which were supposed to legitimize the war against Iraq in 2002, 2003. And so, unfortunately, you could have private interests, intellectuals, or gray area actors who use disinformation, but as well as government. And when government are using disinformation, the legitimacy of the government is at stake. And we need to fight complotism, but complotism is mostly fed by the government lies. Because if you don't trust government, you will trust somebody else. And if you think that the government is a liar, you could be impressed by some things, by a fake news, just because it's a critique of government. And just not to be too long to my first speech, of course, the social networks give a new impact to disinformation, because now disinformation is viral and it could reach much more people and in much more quickly than before. But on the other hand, I don't think that disinformation is only it's only that social network is linked by nature to disinformation, because you have also in mainstream newspaper sometimes disinformation, and sometimes you have a social network critiques of government opinion, critiques which could lead to a better information. I don't think that it's just too soon to speak about how to cope with disinformation. But so the surge of public opinion, the surge of social network give a new impact to disinformation. It's not a new problem. It's as old as information.
Thank you, Pascal. So it sounds like you're saying there's two different things. Maybe there's misinformation, which is information that is wrong, but is not necessarily intentionally wrong, or is not necessarily shared with malintent. But then there's also disinformation, which is the product of concerted campaigns by governments and by other people to try and change narratives and to try and change power. Ultimately, is that
exactly? Exactly.
So we all have a role to play in this. It's not just that this is about Russia or China or the US involved in dis or misinformation campaigns. It's actually something that affects all of us in our daily lives.
Just let me give you an example. In my own country, in France, in March, the spokesperson for the government told to the French people that the masks are not useful against COVID-19. It was obviously misinformation or disinformation because the government has no mask to give to the people. It would have been better to say to the people, we don't have mask. Mask is useful, but we don't have them for the moment. And we will buy them as soon as possible. But no, the words of government regarding COVID-19 is less credible for most of the people due to this initial lie.
Right, absolutely. It is an issue of trust in all of our countries at this point. Thank you, Pascal. Andres, let me turn to you. As a journalist who of course in their daily work is very much working on the truth and on information and on engaging people around information, how is this affecting you? How do you see it from your perspective, and what is the problem exactly?
I mean, it's affecting journalists, and it's affecting pretty much everyone at this point. I mean, I agree with Pascal that we have new tools now for disinformation. I mean, we all thought at some point that social media was going to free, let's say, many people from what some thought at the time the shackles of the traditional media, and it helped a lot, true, on some fronts, but it also became a big problem. And we're having a sort of like a wake-up call now. I mean, you saw how Facebook was sued this week in the US for having a monopoly over information. Actually, I got an email today from a Facebook flag calling the move a historical revisionism, which I found interesting. But, and as you said, interesting, during COVID, some people who have access and funds, obviously, but reverted back to traditional media to get reliable information because they thought, okay, there's too many conspiracy theories on social media. I mean, for example, us in the Financial Times, we got a record subscriptions during the pandemic simply because people were looking for reliable information and not any sort of like conspiracy theories. But all of this spills over into everyday lives and political lives. So when I was a correspondent in Brazil, and not very, very long ago, I mean, I was a correspondent in Brazil until August, I had to report on Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro calling COVID-19 one of his very first sort of like speeches about it, calling the COVID-19 a sniffle or a little flu, which unleashed a whole lot of conspiracy theories on social media, which were then used by pro-Bolsonaro fans to attack journalists and any political foe. Where you're saying it's wrong, again, as Pascal, mask is not useful, look, the president is not using a mask, and so on. And then the president was coming and cheering crowds, well, he got sick. Anyway, so all of this is having an effect on definitely on journalism, but again, it's part of the whole package of how misinformation and disinformation are affecting everyday life. And I think now a more recent and clear example, actually, from what I cover right now, happened during the conflict in Tigray, right here in Ethiopia, over the past few weeks. I mean, the Ethiopian government sealed off Tigray, which is a region in the north of Ethiopia that's been fighting the federal government, and it not only cut off internet and most phone lines, but it also did not allow journalists in, and which this spurred a huge misinformation and disinformation battle. So there was a war of words between both sides. So the federal government in Addis Ababa, the Tigray and TPLF front in Mekelle. I mean, for those who do not follow, I mean, the TPLF is a political force that runs Tigray and has been fighting the federal government. The federal government calls them a criminal clique or a belligerent clique. But so again, this started a massive war of words, and both sides engaged in a very fierce propaganda, essentially to demonize the other. And it was on social media, in broadcast, in print, and both aimed at a domestic and an international audience, also journalists. And it was very, very hard to know who to believe. And that's a problem, not only for democracy itself. I mean, it's the cliche of democracy dies in darkness, but it does happen. And then also the idea of, okay, what's going on? I mean, both sides, at some point, they started deploying arsenals and pass the what they sell facts that were actually contested. For example, I remember the TPLF was saying they downed a fighter jet. The government, no, you did not. And this is a problem. And this is a problem for us journalists, obviously, to try and report what's going on and try and report the facts, but also for the people who's on the other side. I mean, for example, as of today, we still don't know how many people have died in the conflict that lasted a month. So I think this has had a lot of ramifications. For example, the Ethiopian government set up its own sort of like fact unit check, but how much can a government fact check itself? And I think this applies to pretty much, again, everyday life. You have a president like Bolsonaro in Brazil saying, no, COVID-19 is a simple flu, people will follow. People will follow him. And I witnessed them. I was with people coughing in my face in Sao Paulo because they believe the president. And these had ramifications, not just for journalists, but for society as a whole.
Absolutely. And I love some of the examples that you were coming up with because they're absolutely true. If the truth is something that we can still talk about by the sounds of things, but we are seeing these examples of leaders manipulating these sorts of things, of governments obscuring the truth. One question I have for you is, in places like Tigray, and this is true for the work that we do at the Accountability Lab too, we're working in places where social media might not always be accessible. We're talking a lot about the role of social media in spreading fake news, but there are many other ways that rumors and misinformation can spread, even in very low bandwidth communities. Have you seen that in Ethiopia or elsewhere, and how does that happen?
Yeah. I mean, but also even with offline. So in a way, sometimes WhatsApp still works. It's not just what people can get on Twitter or they can get on Facebook. WhatsApp. I mean, in Brazil, for example, WhatsApp. In Rife, I mean, SMSs. I mean, I've been getting SMSs from people with the TPLF integrate because they use operating with very basic phones, but also both sides on the Ethiopian conflict. The federal government and the Tigrayan government, they both have access to state-run media. So the Tigrayan media and the Ethiopian broadcasting, so they will both try and play them up and drum them up. So there's always a way. And then the thing with spreading of misinformation, I think as Pascal was saying, and disinformation is with a simple one SMS or one WhatsApp message that you can get from somebody you trust, your mother, your father, your wife, your husband, your girlfriend, your cousin. Only one person can start finding something without checking if it's true or not. And then that's your own social media that contributes to all of this. I mean, it had a source, but because either they were unwilling or unable to fact check it, then you have a long string of people linked in a chain of humanity that pass along information, which could be misinformation or disinformation, and that's impossible to control.
There's a question that's just come from a viewer that actually relates directly to this point, Andres, about the infodemic, and the way you described it, I think, makes it clear that we are in a pandemic, and there is a chain of connections between people as they pass on this virus. And it's the same with misinformation or disinformation. It's just one person that you trust that perhaps gives it to you, you pass it on, and before you know it, we have this infodemic of information or disinformation that we can't we can't see the truth through.
And again, I think it sort of like feeds into each other. I remember one of my previous jobs was I was corresponding in the Andes in South America, and I covered the end of the Colombian War and the peace process. So there was a very as the conflict in Tigray was sort of like a very divisive issue nationally. And so for those who don't know, the Colombian government there was negotiating with the FARC guerrillas in Cuba to end a 50-year conflict in Colombia, but the FARC were from the left, and the people a lot of people in Colombia, the conservatives, were really against any sort of negotiation with the FARC guerrillas, to a point that the president back then, Juan Manuel Santos, who was then awarded a Nobel Peace Prize, much like Abiy Ahmed last year, they said, okay, I'm going to submit whatever findings to whether peace deal to a referendum. Okay, he lost. And partly because of misinformation and disinformation. I remember getting WhatsApps from people saying, no, I'm going to vote against the peace deal because the FARC are from the left. And if the FARC become a political party and then turn into government, my son is going to turn out to be gay because that's what they're going to teach him at school. That was the level of the debate that a lot of people actually voted because of that. I've spoken to people who said, no, I voted because I didn't want my kid to be taught how to be gay in school. And it was never part of any peace agreement whatsoever. But so that's how this sort of like chain of humanity passes through also, I mean, the chain of misinformation and disinformation goes through the change of humanity.
Right, absolutely. I mean, we're hearing stories now of people on their deathbeds with COVID-19 who still refuse to admit that COVID-19 exists. It's getting more and more challenging, and we can talk maybe a little bit later about how we can begin to tackle some of these problems. But I wanted to turn now to Bushra. Hi, Bushra. Could you tell us a bit more about this issue and how you see it and how you're working on misinformation and disinformation?
Thanks so much, Blair. I guess I'll first start off by kind of defining what an infodemic is as well, and throw in the term malinformation. So just to clarify for our audience, so infodemics are when we have an overabundance of information, whether that's information that's true or false, and it just makes it so much more difficult for them, the general population, to like decipher what is true and assess the quality of that information because there's so much of it. And then malinformation is information that is true, but is being manipulated in order to advance harm on a population or a community or a certain group. And so I think it's important to kind of understand those two terms in addition to misinformation, disinformation, to understand the information landscape. So the way that I approach this issue is from a systems lens, seeing that a lot of these issues, as Andres and Pascal mentioned, are interconnected. So this isn't something that's new. It is being exacerbated, not just because of the digital age or the increase of information online, but we're also seeing the way in which certain narratives by political leaders or other individuals in positions of authority have really shaped the discourse on some of these issues and added distrust when it comes to science or evidence-based information. And a lot of that is also rooted in inequities, and I'll kind of speak to that more later. But I think part of the challenge is that without access to information, and I don't just mean like that the information is available online, it's really difficult for people to exercise their agency and really be able to make informed decisions in their lives. And so that's kind of the area of focus that I've been taking with this, is how is disinformation, misinformation, the infodemic impacting especially marginalized communities, and how in the space sometimes those very communities are the ones who are being targeted with this misinformation because they are more susceptible because of the lack of capacity and media information literacy, for example. And that I think that literacy in particular is a global problem when it comes to people's susceptibility to misinformation and disinformation, because I think we've falsely equated literacy with just being the ability to read and write. So if you are, simply able to read something or able to write, then it's sufficient to claim that somebody's literate. But in fact, it's actually entails more than reading and writing. It's the ability to critically analyze information, assess it, to be able to really think about issues through a critical lens. And sometimes I find that that's lacking. And I think our understanding of literacy is also very colonized. There are certain cultures where information is disseminated mostly orally. So when we equate literacy with simply reading and writing, then we're missing a whole swath of people who express their literacy or understanding of information in a different way. And so I think it's important to think about those communities, especially when we look at Indigenous communities, for example, around the world, who tend to also be the ones who are more marginalized and oppressed when it comes to these issues. So some of the work that I've been doing with the Global Alliance on Partnerships for Media and Information Literacy has focused on the capacity building side of things. And I co-founded the Health and Information Literacy Access Alliance at the outset of the pandemic to make credible, verifiable information on COVID-19 accessible in different languages and formats, recognizing that much of the information that was available was largely in a few languages, and we can maybe look at those languages as being reflective of the official UN languages, for example, but the communities that were already being impacted by the pandemic didn't have information that was accessible to them in their native languages. And that also creates this space where when people don't have that information that's available in a format that, you know, is comfortable for them, is something that they're used to, then you see the spread of that disinformation on those channels, such as WhatsApp, like within your like family groups or within other like maybe some actors that have malintent or are trying to create some of that harm are able to kind of jump in the absence of the information to spin their own narrative or to advance their own narrative. And so I think that's part of the challenge for us, is to think about the information ecosystem as a whole, and how certain populations are like overrepresented in this space. When we look at even journalism, for example, like I don't think it's lost on me that even with our panel today, like we have an overrepresentation of a certain demographic. And so I think that's part of the mistrust that many communities have, is when they don't see themselves reflected in media, or even in positions of leadership. So beyond like the media landscape, when people don't see themselves
Mm-hmm.
reflected in political positions, when they don't see their interests being reflected in their so-called democratic, governments, that also creates a lot of distrust. And then people are more likely to kind of turn to these alternative sources of information that may not actually be verified, may not be rooted in truth and evidence. So I think that's part of the challenge that we have moving forward, is how do we tackle that and truly advance a meaningful practice of democracy beyond just labeling something as democratic. So I think that's part of the challenge that we face as a global community. Because I think there's this narrative even that there's a decline of democracy, but when you look at the surveys, when we're actually polling people, it's not that they don't actually agree with democratic principles. By and large, like the majority of the population globally agrees with these principles, but there is this dissatisfaction with the way that democracy has played out. There's a distrust of political elites, for example, thinking that their interests are not being, represented, they're not being advanced, that the way the system is working is only for a select few. And then so you see certain like political candidates, or again, people in positions of authority, are able to kind of step in that space and then say like, or position themselves as being the change leader, the disruptor, the one who is going to actually represent the interests of the general population, and able to kind of skew their positions, able to also advance some scapegoating. Yeah, so I think that's the challenge that we face is multifaceted. It's not simply one of like, if you were able to fact check all of the information in social media, then we would resolve disinformation or the problem of misinformation. It actually goes further beyond that. And I think a lot of the challenges are rooted in these inequities that we see in our respective communities.
Thank you, Bushra. Really, really interesting, and some big topics in there. I want to come back to you, but I wanted to turn to Pascal, if that's all right, to see what you think, Pascal, about that. Bushra talked about distrust of elites, of this idea that it's not just a question of fact-checking information. There's much deeper issues here of inequity and exclusion. How does that tie into your thinking on these issues, and would you agree? Ooh, you may be on mute again, Pascal.
Sorry. Yes, I'm fully agree with what have been said. Why there is this de-link between elite and the people? First, people are more informed, more educated. And so it's harder to have information from the top to the bottom without any circulation. And I think that the people realize more precisely than before that sometimes the elite are not respectful with them. And so they contest that this lack of respect and this lack of consideration, because with the new generation, everybody wants to be considered as a person and not as a number. And at least in my country, but I think it's a general problem, I think that the elite have still the same reflex, and the regular people are more informed. But the elite look to the regular people like 20 or 30 years ago, when they lack information, when they lack of education, and so on. And why there is some complotism? It's when you have distrust between people and the elite. If you don't trust the elite, you will enter in complotism. And if you want to fight complotism, if you want to restore the link between elite and democracy and people, we need to have elite, because in any field, we need to have good doctors to fight against the COVID-19. We need to have good leaders to manage an enterprise and so on. But we ask them to respect the other. And it's less and less the case. And so if you want to mend democracy, if you want to restore the link, I think that the people who are at the top must have a different look to the people who are at the bottom of the chain, which is not the case for the time being, unfortunately. And sorry, which was acceptable before is no more acceptable now. We are used to see the elite having a despised attitude towards the people. It was considered as what could we do about that? It was always like that and so on. And now people say, no, we don't agree. We need to be respected, and we need our share of the pie.
Would you agree, Andres? And perhaps you could also touch on Bushra's points about the way the voices are reflected in media, and the importance of having stories and information that is communicated by people from communities and in ways and in languages that they understand. How does that feed into the way that you think about this as a journalist?
Yes, I think two things here. First, I mean, Bushra mentioned of the change, this idea of the change leader and the disruptors, which in my experience, in most cases, turn not to be, but they're very good at transmitting that message. Again, Bolsonaro in Brazil is a case in point. He stormed into the scene as he's going to change things. He's the disruptor. He's the outsider. Well, it turns out to be he was a congressman for 28 years, but he used social media very effectively. He spoken a language that most people in Brazil understood, very straightforward, very blunt, sometimes very aggressive, and he got elected. There was a lot of WhatsApping and Twittering and so on and so forth, but now we see that he's reverting back to the old politics, and he needs the elite in order to be able to govern. So there is that tension in general. Trump, another example, he just lost the election. So there is that permanent tension now. I mean, we saw it with Brexit, how much lies were told during the whole Brexit campaign, that now we're having an issue in terms of securing a deal. So I think all of this has been a wake-up call, hopefully, into the elite does not represent the people, but these new sort of like disruptors do not either. So what's in between? What's the alternative? What's coming? And I think this ties into Bushra's point about more representation in the media. I am Latin American. I was born and raised in Argentina, and I work for a British newspaper. But I'm one of the very few ones. Yes, there's a Salvadorian. I have a Salvadorian colleague, but it's originally a British newspaper that has turned into a global newspaper. We're trying to give more voices to a more diverse background in recent times. But of course, there's a lot of work to do. But also, it also depends. This is a two-way street. Who are your readers, and how can you engage more readers? And I think this applies to. That's why there's been a boom of new website and so on and so forth all across the world, which are actually having a strong impact because they speak directly, as Bushra was saying, with this community. So one has to think about, again, this is a conversation. The media is supposed to be a conversation, not just the social media. The traditional media as well should be a conversation, should be, I mean, our role in a way is to put a debate on the table. If I didn't go to the border with Sudan and Ethiopia last week to speak to the Tigrayan refugees, then would people say, okay, you didn't give the voice to them. Well, I tried to do it on the other side, on the Ethiopian, I couldn't. Anyway, but so it's, again, you need to put something on the table. You need to put a piece of information, ideally fact-checked and factually correct on the table, or an argument that has a solid factual background in order to spark a debate. And the debate is part of this conversation. And then you start making, if this is a debate that matters to, for example, I spend a lot of time in the Amazon with Amazonian communities. Is this a debate that matters to indigenous communities in the Amazon? I remember going in July when the pandemic in Brazil was raging to visit indigenous communities in the Amazon, because people were like, I mean, they were all pissed with COVID because of many factors, lack of health systems. I mean, they live in very far away communities, so and then they have low immunity. So the moment one got infected through anyone who passed through, then everybody got infected. So it was having a strong effect, and this is sort of like, it was interesting because it was very reminiscent to the old sort of like colonial times in Latin America when the Portuguese and the Spaniards first brought the diseases. So I remember the indigenous people was telling me, well, but this is a virus of the whites. Well, this was a debate that I thought it needed to put out to the world. My readership may not be 100% aware of what's going on in the Amazon, but the idea was to engage in a conversation and to make awareness. Guys, all of you that are also like senators and fan managers, senators in Washington, fan managers in New York or in Manchester and Tokyo, this is also happening. So I do agree with you. So we need to give more voice to everyone on both sides, on the sides who writes it and broadcasts it, and on the side who actually you address. If you find a topic that is of interest, or you think it could be of interest, then you are all, I mean, you can only expand your audience and give voices, because essentially that's what we do. I mean, in my case, I'm essentially a funnel of opinion. I speak to somebody and then somebody else on the other side reads it. So the broader the scope of people I speak to, and my colleagues, of course, and the broader the scope of people we have on the other side, I think a more cohesive sort of information scene we will have, that we will have an idea or a better understanding of what's going on in the world in this day and age of information and misinformation. A lot of this goes back to the first point about all this, because we're going to see more. They're going to change, the debate is going to be different, but we're going to see more of this idea of, as Bushra called them, the disruptors and the change leaders. We, in the end, so far in my experience, have proved not to be disruptors. Disruptors yet, in a sense, and definitely not change leaders. Or what kind of change leaders? I mean, the changes were actually positive, or we're in a worse position? I mean, going back to Pascal, has these sort of like change leaders and disruptors, through the use of disinformation and misinformation, have undermined democracy? Which then will lead us maybe for the end to the bigger question. I mean, what's the state of democracy? And does democracy needs a sort of restructuring, in which information is going to be a key part of it in order to be more inclusive?
Well, thanks, Andres. And I want to encourage everyone watching and listening once again to drop your comments and questions in the chat box on YouTube or Twitter, and those will be fed over to our discussants here. Bushra, back to you. We've heard a lot from Andres there about how media should also be a conversation, and I suppose that comes back to some extent to your very good point about literacy not just being about reading and writing, but really being able to engage in conversations around what we're reading. What would you say to that, and you know, how do you think we need to change the approach to engaging communities, particularly those that are most excluded, in conversations about democracy and about development and about all of the key issues that we face as a global community?
Well, I guess before I jump into that, I wanted to kind of add to the conversation and what Andres and both Pascal were saying in terms of the status quo or the elites and the resistance to change. And I'm definitely in agreement. I think while there are certain people who are positioning themselves as these change makers or these disruptors, when it comes to the time that they actually take a position of power or authority, little to no changes is made, or at least not in the positive direction, in the sense of they're actually representing the interests of, honestly representing those interests and advancing the well-being of those communities, who they, really, with like even some of the disinformation narratives that these disruptors have been using to kind of galvanize support for them, were like, in many ways misleading their audience, and yet those people still haven't, those supporters have not necessarily, like, after even seeing evidence to the contrary, changed their opinions about these individuals. So I think that is definitely a challenge. I think the other side of that challenge is that for the people who are not positioning themselves as disruptors, or the centrists in some cases, or those who want to uphold the status quo or the so-called normal, there's a lot of resistance to change, and the narrative from them is that, well, people don't really want change. Well, I think that's actually false, because if they're voting for people who are promising change, I think that should be an indication that something needs to change in the way that we're doing things. And I think that ties into the conversation about inequity and inequality, and kind of shifting even our understanding of some of these issues, because in the development space and the humanitarian space, we often talk about empowerment. And I think that in and of itself is a very problematic concept, because it entails somebody giving somebody else power and not recognizing that there are systems in place that are preventing people from exercising their agency. And part of that is because of the lack of media information literacy capacities, or literacy capacities more generally. And we see the undermining of education in that process. I think that Pascal really, like, rightly said that populations are becoming more educated in a sense, in that they have access to far more resources to learn in non-traditional ways. There's more access to information, but that doesn't necessarily translate to having the skills for critical thinking, or having the literacy that's necessary to really be able to understand what's true versus what's false, and to, again, make those evidence-based decisions. And then even beyond, like at the individual level, like how do we make sure that our policies are also rooted in this evidence when there's so many conflicting views? And I think part of the role of media in this space of kind of enabling people to really understand what is true and false, there's been the problem of false equivalencies. So I think that Andres really said something that was really important, that when we're presenting perspectives, they have to be rooted in evidence. So I think the problem is that when we try to approach a situation and say, well, we need to have both sides of the story made available to the public without qualifying that information. And so I think that's part of the challenge that I've seen in some of the media landscapes that I've been following, especially in the US. I would say this is a particular problem. Like, we should just show like both sides of the story, or like try to pull and interview people to see what their opinions are on a given situation, even though we know they're spreading misinformation or disinformation. So I think that's part of the challenge, is like, how do we shift from a space, even when we're talking about issues of racism, for example. I don't think that it's appropriate to be advancing racist ideologies and narratives in spaces, whether it's social media or traditional media, but especially in traditional media, where people may have some level of trust in that there is a fact-checking process, or that people are going through the motions and making sure that the information that's being presented is true. It's especially dangerous when we're not really filtering that information and presenting it in such a way that, like, we're really telling people quite, like, frankly, straightforward, that this is not true. And I think maybe some of this has gotten like better in later stages. It's kind of more reactive than it has been proactive. And I think part of the challenge is the impetus when it comes to the corporate or the capital, like kind of motivations, and like maximizing profits. So like, how do you get more people to click on social media, to view what's being shared by different media organizations? And so that's kind of in some places taken precedent over the really important work that like journalists who are part of these organizations are doing, is being lost by kind of having these other like media personalities who don't even have training maybe in journalism, kind of being presented as being journalists as well. So I think that's also part of the challenge. Like you have an abundance of like actors who claim to be media specialists, who claim to be journalists, but are actually not well versed in kind of the norms or the practices to make sure that the information that is being shared is quality information, and is not even is not creating an opportunity for people to kind of question the realities of various situations. And so I think from the literacy capacity like perspective, I think it's not enough to have like, again, people who have more of this privilege and access, while it's important, again, like having fact checking and having people play this role of like moderating content, that you actually need to build the capacities of individuals as consumers of information, but also producers of information in their communities. So how do we support local media, build the capacities in there? Because then you see a lack of resilience in some systems. So at the outset of the pandemic, for example, when you have an over-reliance on certain sources of information, and that information is not being shared in like a timely or accessible way, and we're not seeing necessarily like the capacities being built for the local media. And in particular, I would say there's the under-resourcing of like Indigenous-led media, as an example, where we actually did see an uptick of like kind of initiatives to share credible information on COVID-19 in different languages and formats, again, using, for example, radio, community radios, to make sure that this factual information was being shared. But a lot of these organizations lack funding. And so it's much more difficult for them to operate and then kind of compete with the people who have far greater budgets, are able to, kind of dominate the content in, again, certain languages and formats. And then we're also thinking about people who, like, as much as we're doing innovating in media, I don't see us kind of getting to a place where we're prioritizing the accessibility of information. And as an example, we know that there are people with like hearing disabilities. Well, we should have sign language being mainstreamed across like our different like media organizations and the way that we disseminate information. And yet it's only done in a certain, certain institutions or organizations who are prioritizing this. And so you're again missing a certain demographic of people. Instead, the innovation tends to be on like things that are more connected to marketing. And we actually all, as a community, like a global community, benefit from investing in greater accessibility. A lot of the benefit that we're seeing even from things like Zoom or remote working have actually stemmed from these like policies that were meant to support people who are disabled or to improve accessibility for certain communities. And so we're actually like benefiting from these policies as a greater community as a whole, but we don't necessarily invest in them or think about mainstreaming them. And I think that's part of the challenge.
Thanks, Bushra. A lot of good thoughts in there too. Andres, I wanted to turn to you in a minute to talk maybe a bit about the journalism side of this. But Pascal, one of the points I think Bushra was making, if we look at it at a macro level, is that there's a lot of money involved one way or another with misinformation and disinformation. There are certain entrenched interests, financial interests. There are people making a lot of money out of this situation. How does that drive what's happening, and what sort of dynamics do you see financially around all of this?
I don't think it's a real change from the former times, because remember Hearst telling to his reporter, "Bring picture, I will bring war." And so it was first with the Cuban War in 1898. It was one good example of misinformation or disinformation by the press, and it was not a matter of finance, it was a matter of political interest, and in this case of strategical interest. Of course, for example, the big pharma will need to bring Barack Obama told in his memory that he has hurt private interests who try to give misinformation to prevent him to make the necessary reform. So of course, if you have some money, it's easier to make some disinformation to protect your financial interest. But I think it's a broader perspective, because in fact, misinformation, disinformation is when your own interest is contrary to general interest. And in this case, you need to make disinformation because your own interest is not corresponding to the general interest. So to protect your selfish interests, you need, or you think that you need to mislead the public opinion. And I think one of the most important source of disinformation is, in fact, not to respect general interest. So it could be for economic reason, but it also for political reason or sometimes for prestige. Just and so you have really different matters.
And it seems that one of the points you're making is we need a policy framework to control perhaps this issue and make sure that some of these private interests don't override public interests.
We need, in fact, what is the contrary to misinformation or disinformation is transparency. Mm-hmm. For example, what is do you have private links with the one you are talking about? With the company you are talking about. We have seen many times, especially in the medical field, that people are telling a good opinion of some medics because they are paid by the laboratory which produce this medication. And you could multiply the example. So transparency is a good way to fight against disinformation and also just the public debate, because if you don't agree with someone is lying, you could just tell him and tell to the public that this person is lying, and you bring the proof of his lie, and the public will trust you a little bit more. But telling that, I must admit that in my own country, I wrote 10 years ago a book which title was Les intellectuels faussaires. And it's true that in my own country, the lie is not, you are not forbidden to lie, and you could lie to the public and continuing to go to the TV, and because you have a strong network. And unfortunately, in US, in the former times, the lie was the best way to be expelled from the public scene. In the United States, it's not anymore the case because Trump has triumphing lying to the public. So that's, I must confess, and it's not very stimulating, that there is not always a penalty for the liar.
Absolutely, it doesn't seem that way anymore, and this is changing the way, of course, the politics happens. But Andres, before we go much further down that road, just coming back to you, particularly on some of the points that Bushra made about how to fact check, how to make sure that what is actually in the mainstream media is verified and is representative of the way that people feel and the things that are happening. How is this changing the way that you work?
I think the way that I work remains the same, and that's one of the beauties of it. Despite everything, we still fact check. I mean, for example, when I file a story, it's read and checked and edited by at least 3-4 people before it's actually being published. So if I screwed up, somebody's going to pick it up, hopefully. But I think all of both Bushra's and Pascal's points are tied. And Pascal, I don't think the lying in public is a French monopoly anymore. But Bushra was making the point about, the two sides, but one side's lying. Yeah, there has been a strong debate on the BBC over the past years, especially since the start of Brexit. And some media, for example, newspapers, we have editorials, we make stances. For example, the FTE, most of you may know that we always thought that Brexit is a very bad idea. And we said it on editorials, I mean, on columns many times, but some of our competitors did not. And then sometimes all these positions are used or abused, whatever you want to say, but on issues that will have an impact on those people who feel that the elite is not representing them. Brexit, climate change. I mean, there's some very well-known media who have been, in a way, actively campaigning against the climate change is a hoax. And there are very many other issues, and we've seen that, especially in the past 4 or 5 years, which actually, I think, it makes us, at least in my case and the colleagues I know from my own newspaper and others, try, and we cannot make a mistake when it comes to facts, because somebody's putting the trust on us, because the trust they cannot put on others, at least for one piece of information. So I really need to focus on what I'm doing, and I really need to get my facts straight. But amidst all this misinformation and disinformation, that yes, Blair, is getting tricky. I think I was referring before to the conflict in Tigray, and sometimes you feel like if misinformation and disinformation are driven by those with the upper hand, in a way, it's also curtailing freedom of information, which also makes very difficult not only to try and find out what's going on, but also to say it. And for example, and I agree totally with Bruce that this brings a big issue on the rights of people. Because if you don't have the right to proper information, are you missing a human right? If you don't really know, or you cannot really know what's going on, who's been affected? So, and again, I'm going back to Ethiopia, for example, on this, because I was just there at refugee camps on the Sudanese-Ethiopian border, and I was talking to alleged victims, because again, it's impossible to complain or to confirm of a massacre. There was a massacre in an area of Tigray that was first unearthed by Amnesty International, which said that according to victims, some groups associated with the TPLF, with the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, slaughtered Amhara ethnic Ethiopians. Okay, then the government blamed directly, the Ethiopian government blamed the TPLF directly. Okay, but when I myself and other colleagues went to these refugee camps, we heard that in the same town, and I've spoken to several people in different camps, from the same town, different people say, actually, my family or my friends were slaughtered by the people they're blaming, the people they're not blaming, the other group. And so I was kind of like, okay, hang on, so there were 2 massacres in the same village, or is the same one that actually, and they're blaming each other because this is part of the conflict. And again, this is part of the misinformation campaign. And again, we go back to the rights of people. So these people who were massacred and the victims, be whoever they are, Tigrayan or Amhara, whoever, they have a right to have the truth out. And the people on the other side have a right to know what's happened. So we will never probably know until we have a proper independent investigation. We were speaking to people who are in the refugee camps and people who can have access in Ethiopia to the people who are the victims of the massacres. Again, if we cannot hear both sides and fact check both sides, we cannot really make up our minds. And I think this goes back to this idea of like, if we are not really properly informed, are we missing human rights? Because some people are not being properly heard and other people are not being properly informed. And this circles back to what we were talking before, and then Pascal was mentioning this idea if misinformation was sort of like a blow to democracy, because this also has a huge component in elections. And we go back to, and now we change from human rights to voting rights. If people are lying to people, we are unable to fact check, or we don't care. And we cannot provide the right information. Some people are losing their voting rights in a way because they are voting misinformed. I mean, again, I mentioned my previous job as a correspondent in Brazil. I mean, I remember that election. I covered the whole, I mean, because the campaign was very long, de facto, and it was rife by misinformation and disinformation, especially over WhatsApp, which is very popular in Brazil. Came in big part from the Bolsonaro camp. I mean, this came out in investigations that came later. There's an investigation of the Supreme Court, there are investigations in Congress about the fake news, as they call it. But also it's, let me put it this way, it's supply and demand. So Brazilians say insatiable appetite for social media and any sort of information, and a very emotional time, because that's the other element. Increasingly politics, issues such as civil conflicts in Ethiopia, elections in Brazil and India, Brexit in the UK, elections in the US, have become very emotional. And so it's kind of like, I feel, then I see if I think. That's kind of the current. It's then that's kind of the current sort of like status of the debate, if we can call it is. So it's the complete opposite of the Cartesian one. So if the people was truly misinformed, because we go back to this change of humanity, my cousin sent me a WhatsApp and then I distributed to over 250 people in 30 seconds. Nobody fact-checked it, or very people did, and then they didn't care to transmit it. Then, okay, I'm gonna vote, some people did, on that WhatsApp message. But that was probably a lie. And if that was a lie, are you curtailing my voting right because I voted for the person who's gonna run my country for the 4, 5, 6 years on something that was not true? Is that curtailing my voting rights? So I think this, as you said, Blair, has huge implications for societies as a whole. And in a way, everyone's responsible. So us delivering information, try to deliver information, the elites for taking advantage of the information tools, these disruptors for taking even more advantage of these misinformation tools, people who are the receivers, who may be the victims, but also they may not be able to fact check even with a phone call, but maybe they can't. So we go back to Bushra's point about inequity. So it's a very comprehensive problem, put it that way. And I still believe that is going to carve our ways of life, politically, financially, socially, over the past decade at least. And so I don't know, to be honest, I don't know if more regulation is the way, or what kind of legal framework that should be. Honestly, I cannot say, because as a journalist, I will always say, okay, freedom of information and freedom of speech will come at the forefront, so everybody should be able to say whatever they want. Yes, but I'd say over the past decade, we have seen that this brings problems. So what's the balance? Where can we strike the balance onto not curtailing people's humans' voting, economic rights through disinformation and misinformation?
Thank you, Andres. Really, really interesting. We're joined by Richard Worley. Hi, Richard.
Hello. My
apologies.
I was wrong about the timing. I'm in Paris, France, and I thought that I had to join at 4 p.m. That's my stupid mistake. I didn't read the last email that you or someone else sent. Sorry, apologies.
No, that's quite all right. Let me just introduce you. You're the European Affairs correspondent for Le Temps.
Correct.
We have people watching and listening online, and we've got into a very interesting conversation in your absence around all sorts of issues related to disinformation and misinformation. And I wanted to turn to you, Bushra, just in response to what Andres just said, and that dilemma that he set up between this right to information and this right to know, but also disinformation and abuse of information. What would you say on that point?
Well, I think that it's important for us to distinguish between the right to information and then the right to disinformation or misinformation. We don't have a right to misinformation or disinformation. And so I think that's where we make that distinction, because unfortunately, some people have, falsely equated the ability to have freedom of speech with being able to just blatantly lie to people and spread conspiracy theories and spread harm. And I think it's really important in this way, because I think the core of this very situation is the right to know, and the right to knowledge itself, rooted in evidence and fact, because that is intrinsically connected to the right to exist. It's not merely to have this label of being an informed individual in the sense of, having kind of this prestige, look at me, I'm so informed about the world, but having an informed opinion, a deep understanding of what is happening, is really critical for people to make those decisions in their lives that will enable them to advance their well-being, to advance their political rights, to be able to engage in democracy in meaningful ways. So I do agree with Andres that there is that connection with the right to know and the right to exist, and that these things I think need to be made more like solidified, and that in order to kind of address this issue, we need to tackle the disinformation, that we don't actually have a right to disinformation, we don't have a right to misinformation, and we don't have a right to misinform people. So I think once we make that distinction, because unfortunately I think there's that famous quote by Voltaire, like, I may disagree with what you say, but I'll defend your right to say it. Well, I think we can disagree on opinions. I think the disagreement on facts is a whole other situation. So if people are questioning that, that's where I would draw the line. Like, I think it's important to definitely debate, to be able to engage in dialogue and discourse around different opinions on how we should move forward at things, or opinions about a situation. But when those opinions are made to be misleading, that aren't rooted in evidence, I think that's when we can call things into question, and not, again, defend people's right to misinformation or disinformation, because I don't actually think we have a right to that. The right is to information itself, and there's a right to knowledge, but there isn't this right to disinformation. And so I think that's where I would make that distinction.
Thank you, Bushra. And we have some questions coming in from people watching and listening. Please continue to send those in on YouTube or Twitter or Facebook or wherever you're watching, and we will see if we can answer them. One question, perhaps Pascal, that I can direct towards you to begin with, is about the role of the World Health Organization in tackling the infodemic during COVID-19. And maybe I can broaden the question a bit and ask about generally the role of the international system in all of this. How are we responding on that international level to these kinds of challenges, and what could we do better?
Yes, we could have done better, but it's I would say to the World Health Organization the same thing than to United Nations. They have they could make some mistakes, but the world will be less safe and more insecure without them than with them. And yes, it's they probably miss at the beginning of the crisis a point, and they probably have they were 1 or 2 weeks late regarding to alerting people, but because they, on the other hand, they need to keep the contact with China to have access to information. So it was not so easy for them. But on the other hand, you just have to look who is attacking World Health Organization. Not exactly people who are interested in truth. Not always people who want to promote multilateralism and to promote the common goal. And it was mostly an attack from Trump and his advocates because they were in trouble and they want to find a scapegoat. And World Health Organization was a useful scapegoat. And so, of course, they could improve their process, but I think that at the end of the day, they have done a good job. And Bill Gates, for example, who is not, in my view, a Chinese agent, told that World Health Organization has done a good job to make the crisis, to prevent the crisis to reach a greater extent, but he has done without the implication of World Health Organization. I think that to say that World Health Organization is a Chinese agent is a disinformation, politically motivated.
Thank you, Pascal. I want to take the opportunity, Richard, maybe to bring you into all of this. As we move maybe in this last piece of the conversation and with some questions from our audience towards solutions to all of these challenges, what are the solutions that you say that you see as a journalist to some of these challenges? How can we support people, as Andres pointed out, to understand their role in all of this and to push back against misinformation and disinformation?
Thank you very much, Blair. As far as a journalist, again, you're right, because that's my position and that's my work. Let's take the example of the World Health Organization. Pascal is absolutely right. You've got to see who is attacking the World Health Organization. So I believe that's the first part of the play. We need always to remind, for me as a journalist, our readers, for you as think tank, your audience, we have to remind of all parties concerned, because not all parties concerned are equal when it comes to information. You've got people who try, let's say, genuinely to inform. They may be wrong, they may make mistake, but they are genuine in their willingness to inform properly about a certain subject. And you've got other parties who don't want to inform, but want either to lobby or to misinform. And I believe the first step we've got to do is to identify the party concerned and make sure that we don't put on the same level those who are genuinely trying to inform, though they may make some mistake, and the others who are not trying to inform. And I believe it's very much true for the World Health Organization. Now, when it comes to the pandemic, for example, one of the problems clearly is, let's say, the pharmaceutical industry, and the suspicion that the pharmaceutical industry is somewhat taking advantage of the pandemic. That is a legitimate concern, and that should be addressed by the WHO. And I believe one of the problem at the moment is that the WHO, for reason we know, because it receives money from different funds and so on, the WHO is quite reluctant to go into that. I'm still expecting as a journalist, and as you know, my paper is based in Geneva, which is also the seat of the WHO. They are in Geneva as well. We are still expecting the first briefing from WHO on the background of the vaccine. For example, which pharmaceutical companies are involved, who are the owners of this pharmaceutical company, what are their links with the governments. We're still expecting that. And I believe on this specific field, some piece of information is lacking. It would be great for an organization like the WHO to provide such, let's say, a neutral analysis of the pharmaceutical industry and COVID-19. So this is something that we could consider a legitimate request. We would need the WHO to provide that piece of information. Now, generally speaking, the challenge is for us, the journalists, for those who are emitting the information, or for you, the think tank, because you are also emitting a piece of information. The challenge is, how do we manage to spread our information as much and as well those who are either propagandists or lobbyists? So we've got a problem there. Very often we are too shy, I would say, because we believe that because our information is genuine, we should be careful on the way we distribute it. So we should be much more proactive in terms of disseminating good information. I believe government should help disseminate good information. So there is a challenge there. There is let's say, a challenge, a financial challenge even, because you need money to do that. And finally speaking, can we counter disinformation? Unfortunately, I believe we cannot. We can balance, but certainly not counter, because there will always be groups or governments or organizations whose interest is to spread false information. We are not going to annihilate them. We're not going to forbid them. They will still be there, either in their own capacity or through different fake identities. So we're not going to eradicate misinformation, but we need to challenge them permanently. And we need to let the public know that these people are not, let's say, legitimate and credible informants. So this is the way I see it. So let's forget about the dream of getting rid of misinformation. Misinformation is like the weather. We've got to live with it. If you live in a rainy country, it will rain over your head. You will not have the rain disappear. If you live in the Sahara, it will be dry and hot. So this is the time we are living in, but we've got to be more proactive, stronger, and certainly convinced that the job we are doing, us as journalists, is a job that needs to be defended.
Thank you, Richard. Very
may
good.
May I ask a question to Richard?
Oui, Pascal.
Okay, Richard, I fully agree what you have told, but in the case, for example, you need a colleague who writes something you know it's untrue. Will you dismiss his view, or some of your colleagues will say that, oh, it's my colleague, it's very hard to attack someone who is doing the same job? That's because we are living in the same circle. So is there not a risk? And same for the think tank. So it's not, it's sometimes difficult to attack people you are in your inner circle, because you risk to make some foes and to have some professional difficulties. And sometimes you have the choice of respect your interest or respect the truth. But respecting the truth could lead you to attack powerful people and people who are belonging to the same. So if you are an insider, it's very difficult to attack other insider. And so I will be happy to have your opinion on that.
Pascal, you're absolutely right. And what you say is especially true for the journalists who have this fatal, terrible tendency of protecting each other. We are a bad group of people. When we are professionally, we move like wolves in a way. We are always together and we hate criticizing each other. So you're perfectly right on that. What would I do myself if I discover that a colleague has written something wrong on the subject I know? Let me be clear on that. You have to know the subject before you judge if it's true or not true. But if it is a subject I would know and I would see that a colleague is writing something wrong, I will certainly first in my newspaper, if it happened in my newspaper, ask why this story has come out. And if we realize that it is a problem with our readers, we have the duty to open up the debate. And very often, we are not opening the debate enough. We like to publish op-eds in our newspaper, but we don't like to publish op-eds which are criticizing our own journalists. And I believe we should do more of that, because people are expecting us to face criticism. Readers are expecting us to face criticism. So my answer to your question would be, we should have not ombudsman. I'm not a big fan of the ombudsman, médiateur en français thing. I'm not a big fan of that, but I think that in our op-ed page, we should, let's say, devote 20 to 30% of our op-ed to readers who are critical of what we write, and who eventually argue with good arguments, different views than the one we are defending. So Pascal, you must be always welcome if you feel that a journalist from Le Temps has not written something proper, especially if it's me. You can take my word, I will plead for you to be published in Le Temps.
The problem is, it would be hard for me to find a lie from your part. So
that's good to hear. Yes, Andres, please jump in.
Can I jump? Because I think it all ties together to what Busha was saying before, and I'm going to call it that.
Absolutely.
The right of people to say something, the Voltaire idea, with the right of other people, and especially us, to call out the lies, falsehoods, and bullshit, whatever you want to call them. And this increasingly should be equated, because we're increasingly seeing, at least maybe because there are more tools to fan out the falsehoods and the lies, but it should be now a more of like a sort of like an even playing field. And we know, as Pascal and Richard were saying, this is going to get a stronger debate now as the vaccine campaigns approach, not only with the focus on the WHO, but also on Pfizer and AstraZeneca and Oxford and so on, because we are going to have the vaccines getting into political campaigns. For example, in countries like Brazil, it already is. The state of Sao Paulo has chosen the Chinese one, and the federal governments were not very happy with the political decision of that. So then we are going to start getting misinformation also on the anti-vaccination campaign. So all of this is going to start playing out. And these points about, okay, you can say it, but we also have the right to call you out, is going to be increasingly very, very, very important during what's coming in the next few months in terms of the vaccination campaign worldwide. And sorry, And Bushra's point about inequity, which country is going to get it first? How are you going to get it? How are you going to distribute it in poorer countries? Who's going to benefit from information and what's right, what's wrong, and so on and so forth? Bushra, over to you. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I was just going to emphasize, I think, the point that you made and say that while they have the right to say it and we have the right to call it out, I think there's also the part where they don't have the right to have that amplified. So that doesn't mean that we need to share that information widely and distribute that misinformation in particular or disinformation. And I think that's part of the challenge, is that that tends to be what happens. And I guess I have a question for Richard. Well, if your audience doesn't notice that something is false, because if we're waiting for the audience to kind of notice before we like respond or have somebody write an op-ed in a journal or like a media outlet, how would you kind of tackle that scenario? Because if we do have a disinformed public who's been digesting this misinformation and disinformation, it can be difficult for them to even like understand if something is not true. And so then you would have this kind of risk of waiting for them to call it out or notice it before there's any kind of proactive measures taken on the organizational side.
Well, it's obviously difficult to talk about that without specifying, for example, one subject. So let's take an example, if you don't mind. Take the example of the pandemic. We were talking about the WHO. Take the example of one of the journalists from my own newspaper would write something wrong about, let's say, the WHO. Okay, so the information is false, not because he wanted it to be false, but simply because he was ill-informed, or he did not investigate enough, or he used a source which was not reliable. So an article comes out about the WHO which is not correct, okay? And we don't know it because we are not expert into that. But some of our readers, because we are published in Geneva, as you can guess, we are read by a number of diplomats. So some of our readers know that what has been published is wrong. So my opinion on that, and I would elaborate on what I was telling Pascal, I believe newspapers, let's say newspapers, be they online or print, it doesn't make any difference. We should think of set up a kind of red alert system where readers could eventually trigger a kind of alert, maybe visible on the web, where when they see something they believe is wrong or they know is wrong on a story, they could eventually push a button on our website and it would flag the story and it would alert the editor-in-chief about the need to correct or at least to review the story. What I'm saying now doesn't exist, but when I listen to your question, I believe that could be something interesting to put in place. So for the readers, for the audience, to have a way to not to correct the content directly, but to alert the management of the newspaper and eventually the colleague himself about the mistake and the need to correct it.
Thank you, Richard. I think that's a good practical idea for one kind of solution to some of these sorts of challenges. I know we're rapidly running out of time of a really, really interesting conversation. So maybe to wrap things up, I could come back to all of you and ask you to talk a bit more about the solutions that you see. Bushra, maybe I can talk to begin with you. You mentioned, for example, support for indigenous media as something that is needed, which I think we'd agree with. What other ideas do you have that are concrete and practical that we could think about to try and counter this misinformation and disinformation going forwards?
I think we need to make it a priority to make information accessible to people. And right now, I see a phenomenon where misinformation and disinformation is free, but facts and evidence are kind of hidden behind paywalls, whether that's with like media organizations or even when it comes to journals, where like the latest evidence is being shared on different issues. A lot of that is inaccessible to the general population. So if you do have that privilege and access, maybe you can inform yourself better. But for the wider population, that information isn't accessible. And I think that's kind of a priority going forward in like the knowledge generation community, is to maybe make things more accessible through open access policies, advancing these ideas of open science, I think more investments need to be made there, and to decolonize our understanding of science as well. Because if we're talking about things rooted in evidence, we also need to make sure that it's not reflective of only one group's knowledge systems or understandings of the world, but rather like really including especially marginalized people who have been excluded from the spaces where decisions have been made, from governance spaces, and connecting to that to invest in governance itself, more inclusive and equitable governance, so that we can actually have this greater sense of equity for communities, and that their perspectives are represented. So there's less of that feeling that, you know, there's the political elites that don't represent them. There's this mistrust or distrust of organizations and experts even. And then investing in media information literacy capacities and making comprehensive literacy mainstreamed across education curriculum around the world. Because I don't think it's so much of a question of, well, you're in the so-called global north or global south, and if you're in the global north, you have literacy capacities, because I don't think what we're seeing right now is that the general population does have comprehensive literacy capacities. Yes, they can read and write, but can they actually analyze and critically assess information? I think that can come into question, and that is a result of underfunding of education as well. So.
Thank you, Bushra. Some really good ideas in there. Pascal, maybe I could turn to you. What do you think the concrete solutions to all of this are? And one additional question for you would be also, what's the next frontier of all of this? You know, we're talking about the kinds of misinformation and disinformation we know about now, but there are things like deep fakes, which are, of course, becoming more and more popular and challenging for us to deal with. What else is on the horizon that we might need to think about on this topic as well?
In the past, you have people who believe that Elvis Presley was still living and he was hidden in some far place to play again. And so you have always this kind of thing. So no, it's more visible than before. But so I think that, and I agree with what I've been told before, it's the solution. It's a contradictory debate, to have different positions and to be able to point the lie and to give opportunity to the public to make a comparison. I think that the fact that now everybody on earth is both could give his opinion is a huge progress. Sometimes this opinion is ill-informed, sometimes it's misinformed, but at least you have the capacity to give a different word. And the information is no longer from the top to the bottom, but it's more horizontal. No, it's no more vertical. And I think it's a progress. And I will say that people are clever enough to make a difference. At the end of the day, people will make the difference between the truth and the lie. Of course, we won't be in a world in which the truth will triumph for everybody. You will always have people who believes untrue story. But I think that the fight between misinformation and real information is a work in progress and is in progress every day.
Maybe I can say a word.
Please, Richard, yes, very briefly. Yeah, we have about 4 minutes.
I am sorry to say, Pascal, but I met Elvis Presley in the US last month. So it's simply that you didn't find him. That's the difference between you and me. As a journalist, I found him. No, Pascal is absolutely right. The contradictory debate is certainly the solution. Once again, I'm personally, if you take the example of France, where I am now based, I'm not a big fan of this law, which tend to eradicate the false information from the internet. I don't think we're going to solve anything by law. Moreover, because whenever there is a law in place, you trigger more desire to do something illegal. So I believe we do have to be information watchers, all of us. We do have to help each other to counter the weight of false information. And your forum today, sorry I was late attending the discussion, is certainly a way to be more active and proactive about disinformation.
Thank you, Richard. Andres, over to you. Any last words or thoughts on solutions to all of this?
Well, one thing, I mean, there's still people in my native Argentina who think like Hitler died there only a few years ago. So it's not just Elvis in the US. But I think, I don't know, honestly, if there's a solution. I truly don't. But I think that the long term and the short term, the long term, Bush mentioned is the key one, that is education. And the more universal, the more accessible, the better people will be prepared. And then the second one will lie mostly in us, all of us who are privileged by being educated at whatever level. I feel I am obscenely educated sometimes because I went to good universities, but anyone who can actually raise awareness. One thing that they taught us in journalism school is like, you need to write as if your 74-year-old aunt is reading you or listening to you or watching you. Well, it's in all of our interest to everyone we talk to raise awareness about this issue. This doesn't mean that it's going to spread out too much, but at least I will feel we will be doing some part of it. And I think Bushra, but there was another point here that is going to come forward on if we have a doomsday scenario, but something that we need to keep in mind for what's coming is artificial intelligence and what this could also fuel more disinformation, or if ideally it could help in fact checking because they will have access to databases. So I think this will be something to keep an eye on, how artificial intelligence is going to actually help fight disinformation and misinformation, or will actually contribute to misinformation and disinformation.
Thank you, Andres. A good place to stop. I think we're out of time. Lots for us to do, but also some challenges that lie ahead. Thank you so much, Andres. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Bushra. Thank you, Pascal. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you to everyone watching. Please follow up on Twitter. We're all there. We can answer questions and carry on this conversation online. And think before you share. That's the key message from all of this. Thank you so much, everyone, and stay safe.
Thank you.
The coronavirus outbreak is rapidly changing our planning and orientations as the world is trying to cope with COVID-19 and face its consequences and challenges. At the Policy Center for the New South, we gave our annual Atlantic Dialogues flagship conference a one-year rest while embracing the rapid digitalization brought forth by the pandemic to offer a virtual alternative. This year's online AD talks are digitally bringing together the AD community that is at the heart of the conference's success, growth, and sustainability.